Maybe if you begged, he'd take pity on you. Sera Ashwood kept her eyes on the cracked cobblestones while her aunt's voice echoed across the packed commons. Every wolf in Thornridge had assembled to watch her latest humiliation, their expressions ranging from barely concealed glee to uncomfortable pity. This was the third time in 2 years that a proposed match had fallen through. The third time she'd been rejected publicly, her inadequacies catalogued for everyone to witness. "Stand up straight," Aunt Margot hissed, circling her like a predator testing wounded prey. "At least pretend you have some dignity left, even if we both know it's a lie." Sera's hands trembled where they clutched the simple cotton of her skirt. 26 years old, plain-featured, with a wolf so weak she'd barely managed her first shift at 18 instead of the normal 13. She was everything a pack considered a liability, nothing they'd celebrate. Her younger cousin Vivian stood at the edge of the crowd, radiant in silk that Sera's seamstress wages had helped purchase, whispering to the young males who'd never looked at Sera twice. The contrast was deliberate, calculated to demonstrate the family hierarchy. The merchant's son said she was desperate and dull, someone called from the crowd. Said talking to her was like watching paint dry. The laughter that followed felt like claws raking across Sera's skin. But she'd learned long ago that showing pain only encouraged them. So she stood there, silent and still, and waited for this torture to end. "Where is this mysterious helper of yours?" Margot demanded suddenly, switching tactics with predatory precision. "The northern stranger who's been sniffing around you these past weeks." Sera's breath caught. She'd been careful, so careful, about keeping those interactions private. But apparently not careful enough. "I heard he's been repairing that hovel you call a workshop," another voice added, probably expecting payment in the only currency a woman like her can offer. The implication hung in the air like poison. Sera felt heat crawl up her neck, shame and anger warring inside her chest. But then the crowd began to part. She knew his footsteps before she saw him. Steady, measured, carrying a weight that made the air feel thicker. For 6 weeks, those footsteps had become the best part of her days. The stranger called himself Kieran. He'd arrived in late spring with nothing but a weathered pack and stories about seeking work in the Northern Territories. Dark hair, storm-gray eyes, a face that looked like it had seen too much but refused to break. He moved with fluid grace that suggested warrior training, though he claimed to be nothing more than a wandering craftsman. He'd appeared at her workshop one morning, asking if she needed help with the carpentry orders that kept piling up faster than she could complete them. She'd said no, of course, because she couldn't afford to pay anyone. But he'd returned the next day anyway, and the day after that, working without demanding coin or explanation. 6 weeks of shared labor. 6 weeks of conversations that stretched longer each evening. 6 weeks of feeling like maybe, possibly, she wasn't as worthless as everyone claimed. Now he walked through the hostile crowd with his shoulders squared and his expression calm, completely unbothered by the judgment radiating from every direction. He wore simple clothes, worn leather vest, patched shirt, boots that had seen better days, but carried himself like he owned the ground beneath his feet. When his gray eyes found hers, something in Sera's chest cracked open. Relief. Recognition. Something deeper she didn't have words for. "So you came," Margot said, her voice dripping false sweetness. "I half expected you to disappear once you realized the girl has nothing to offer except neediness and a family name that's worth less than dirt." Kieran didn't answer immediately. He walked straight to where Sera stood and extended his hand, palm up, waiting. "Get up," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that seemed at odds with his vagrant appearance. "You don't stand here being judged like this. Not anymore." Sera stared at his hand. Calloused from work, scarred across the knuckles, strong. She'd watched those hands craft intricate woodwork with impossible precision, had felt them steady her when she'd nearly fallen from a ladder, had imagined more times than she'd admit what they'd feel like. She placed her hand in his and let him pull her up. The crowd murmured, sensing this wasn't following the expected script. Sera's aunt looked like she'd bitten into something rotten. "I need to speak with you," Kieran said, turning to face Margot directly. "About your niece." "Oh, this should be entertaining." Margot crossed her arms. "Let me guess, you've decided you want damaged goods after all. Planning to make an honest woman of Thornridge's greatest disappointment." "I'm planning to offer her a choice," Kieran replied evenly, "which is apparently more than anyone else here has bothered to do." He looked back at Sera, and his expression softened just slightly. "I know I'm nobody. A drifter with no pack, no property, no prospects anyone here would respect. But I see you, Sera. I see someone who works harder than anyone I've ever met, who creates beautiful things with her hands, who deserves better than being told she's worthless by people who wouldn't recognize value if it carved their furniture. Sera couldn't breathe. The entire commons had gone silent, everyone watching this impossible scene unfold. What exactly are you offering? Margot's voice had gone sharp, suspicious. Marriage, if she'll have me. Kieran never looked away from Sera. Not because I pity her or because I'm desperate. Because spending the last 6 weeks working beside her has been the most peaceful thing I've experienced in longer than I can remember. Because she makes me want to be better than I am. Marriage to a vagrant, someone in the crowd scoffed. That's even worse than staying single. Is it? Kieran's question cut through the mockery. I have hands that work, skills that provide, and enough respect for her to ask rather than assume. That's more than anyone here has offered. He squeezed Sera's hand gently, then released it, giving her space to decide. You don't have to answer now. You don't owe me anything. But if you want someone who'll stand beside you instead of above you, who'll value your partnership instead of treating you like a burden to be managed, I'm here. I'll be here tomorrow and the day after, whether you say yes or no. Sera looked at him. This stranger who'd appeared 6 weeks ago and somehow made her feel seen for the first time in her life. This man who asked for nothing but seemed to offer everything. Then she looked at Aunt Margot, at the crowd, at Vivian's shocked face, at 26 years of being told she'd never be enough. Yes, Sera whispered. Then, louder, yes. I'll marry you. The explosion of gossip was immediate and vicious, but Kieran's smile made it all fade into background noise. He took her hand again, this time threading their fingers together, and faced the crowd with quiet certainty. Then it's settled, he said. We'll handfasten under tomorrow's moon, with or without your blessing. Margot's face went purple. Handfasting is archaic. No decent wolf uses those old rites anymore. Good thing we're not trying to be decent, then. Kieran's voice carried an edge now. Just honest. 3 months earlier, the war room of Silverpeak Keep was carved from ancient granite, its walls bearing the scars of centuries. Theron Blackmoor stood at the head of the massive oak table, listening to the same argument he'd heard for 15 years. Your Majesty, you're 39 years old, Lord Cassian said, his silver hair gleaming in the torchlight. The succession cannot remain uncertain. The succession is fine, Theron replied, his tone carrying the kind of patience that came from repeating the same conversation too many times. I'm healthy, capable, and not particularly inclined to die soon. But without a lunar queen, without heirs, Lady Isadora leaned forward, her political instincts sharpening every word. The minor packs grow restless. They see a king without a mate bond and wonder if perhaps the old bloodline has lost the favor of the moon. Theron's storm-gray eyes swept across the assembled council. They meant well. They genuinely believed a strategic marriage would stabilize everything. What they didn't understand was that his wolf had rejected every suitable female presented over the years with increasing hostility. He wouldn't bind himself to someone his instincts found lacking just to produce heirs who'd inherit a throne built on compromise. I appreciate your concerns, Theron said, his tone making it clear the discussion was ending. But I won't marry for politics. When I find my true mate, you'll be the first to know. Until then, Silverpeak remains strong under my leadership. The council exchanged glances but didn't push further. They'd learned that once Theron decided something, arguing was pointless. As the meeting concluded and councillors filed out, only Marcus remained, Theron's beater and closest friend since childhood. You felt it again last night, Marcus said quietly once they were alone. During the moon rites. Theron's hands gripped the table edge. Marcus knew him too well. A pull, east and south, faint but persistent. Like a thread I can't quite follow. Mate bond? Maybe. Or wishful thinking after decades alone. Theron straightened, pushing away from the table. Either way, it doesn't matter. I have more pressing concerns. The border situation, Marcus confirmed. 3 villages reported unauthorized crossings. Rogues moving in organized groups instead of the usual scattered loners. And now we have reports that Alpha Donovan is allowing human mercenaries into his territory. Theron's expression darkened. That violates the Treaty of the 5 Peaks. If he's made an alliance with hunters, we need proof before we can act. Marcus pulled out a map, marking the affected regions. But approaching officially will just drive everything underground. Theron studied the map, his strategic mind already working through options. I need to see it myself. But if I arrive with a royal escort, everyone will perform. They'll hide their schemes and feed me carefully crafted lies. You want to go alone? Marcus didn't phrase it as a question. Alone and unrecognizable. Theron moved to the window overlooking the mountain valley his family had ruled for generations. I'll mask my scent, dress as a common craftsman, travel as someone beneath notice. People speak freely around those they consider powerless. That's dangerous. Then you'd make an excellent king in my place. Theron shot him a dry look. But nothing will happen. I'll spend a few weeks gathering intelligence, return with enough evidence to dismantle whatever Donovan's planning, and be back before the Autumn Council. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When? Tomorrow night. I'll announce a spiritual retreat. The old traditions allow for a month of solitary communion with ancestral spirits. No one questions it. And if you find your mate while pretending to be nobody. Theron laughed hollowly. The odds are insignificant. That pool could have been anything. It's probably nothing. But even as he said it, his wolf stirred restlessly, and Theron knew he was lying to himself. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees when Theron, now calling himself Kieran, first saw her. He'd been in Thornridge less than 2 hours, just long enough to stable his horse and ask about work. The village was exactly what his reports described, struggling, isolated, caught between territories and belonging fully to neither. The kind of place where an extra pair of hands wouldn't draw suspicion. He was heading toward what appeared to be a craftsman's district when he noticed a woman struggling with a massive piece of timber, trying to maneuver it through a workshop doorway alone. She had auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid, wore a leather apron over simple clothes, and her face was set in determined concentration as she wrestled with wood that clearly outweighed her. Every time she got it positioned, it would slip, and she'd have to start over. Something inside Theron went absolutely still. His wolf, dormant for so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have it truly awake, suddenly surged forward with intensity that nearly staggered him. The enchanted medallion hidden beneath his shirt, designed to suppress his alpha aura and royal scent, kept the outward signs contained. But inside, every instinct roared at him to go to her, take that timber from her hands, position himself between her and whatever had put those shadows of exhaustion in her eyes. He couldn't explain it. She was nobody special, a village craftswoman in worn clothes, struggling with a task too large for her frame. But his wolf didn't care about logic. His wolf saw her and recognized something fundamental that transcended reason. Mate. The word resonated through him like a bell struck, and Theron realized the faint pull he'd felt during the moon rites hadn't been imagination. It had been this. It had been her. He watched as she finally got the timber through the door, then stood there flexing her hands, small splinters embedded in her palms. She pulled them out one by one with practiced efficiency, like this was just another normal difficulty in a long list of them. Then she picked up another piece of wood and started the process over again. Theron followed. He approached as she was mid-wrestle with the second timber. That looks heavy. Need help? She jumped, nearly dropping the wood, and spun with wide eyes. Up close, she was younger than he'd thought, mid-20s, though weariness made her seem older. Her eyes were amber, flecked with gold, studying him with immediate wariness. I can manage, she said, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who'd learned not to trust offers of help. I'm sure you can, Theron replied easily. But capable doesn't mean you have to do everything alone. I'm new here, just arrived. Name's Kieran. Figured I'd introduce myself and see if anyone needs help. I'm decent with woodwork. She hesitated, glancing at her splinter-marked palms, then back at him. You're looking for paid work. Eventually. Right now, I'm looking to build a reputation. Help someone where it's visible, show I'm reliable. That's worth more than immediate coin. It was a reasonable explanation, practical and strategic. But the truth was simpler. His wolf wouldn't let him walk away. Sera, she said finally. Sera Ashwood. And if you're serious about helping, I have 6 orders due by week's end and only got 2 finished. Then let's make it 8 finished. Theron took the timber from her hands, careful not to reveal just how easy the weight was for him. Where does this go? Something flickered in her amber eyes. Surprise. Maybe hope. Inside, against the far wall. They worked until twilight painted the sky purple and gold, and Theron learned things about her that made his wolf settle deeper into certainty with every passing hour. She was 26, had been crafting furniture since she was 14 when her parents died and left her to her aunt's care. She loved the work itself, the smell of fresh wood, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from raw materials. But she struggled to make ends meet because her aunt's family took most of her earnings as rent for the workshop space. She had a quiet strength that came from years of endurance. She found peace and precision in detail. She had small kindnesses hidden inside her like seeds waiting for the right conditions to grow. And with each conversation, his wolf settled deeper into certainty. This wasn't just attraction or even simple mate recognition. This was the other half of his soul, hidden in the last place anyone would think to look. When darkness finally forced them to stop working, Sera walked him to the workshop door, her amber eyes reflecting lamplight. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That was kind. More than I'm used to." "I'll be back tomorrow," Theron heard himself say. "If that's all right." She studied him for a long moment, wariness and hope warring in her expression. "You don't have to." "I know. But I want to." After she closed the door, Theron stood in the darkening street and felt his careful plans dissolving around him. He'd come here to investigate a conspiracy, to gather intelligence, to protect his kingdom. He'd found his mate instead, and absolutely nothing about his mission was going to proceed the way he'd planned. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost too good to be real. Kieran arrived at Sera's workshop each morning with borrowed tools and quiet competence. He worked beside her without demanding conversation, but when they did talk, it felt effortless, natural, like something that had been waiting to happen for longer than either of them realized. Sera found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. The way his hands moved with impossible precision, creating joints so perfect they needed no nails. The way he listened when she spoke, actually listened, like her words mattered. The way he smiled, rare but genuine, when she made an unexpected joke. She brought him water at midday. At first, she'd leave it and retreat quickly, but gradually she began to stay. They'd sit on the workshop steps, sharing bread and conversation about inconsequential things that somehow felt significant. Theron learned that she'd taught herself advanced joinery from a book she'd found in a merchant's discard pile. That she dreamed of creating furniture for wealthy packs someday but knew it was impossible. That she found peace in the forest when she could escape there. That she had hope buried so deep inside her it took careful excavation to find it. And with each conversation, the deception grew heavier on his conscience. He was investigating Alpha Donovan's activities, yes. He'd confirmed through careful observation and strategic questions that rogues were indeed moving through the territory with suspicious frequency. He'd documented meeting sites where wolf and human sense mingled in ways that suggested coordination rather than conflict. But those discoveries felt secondary now to the woman working beside him, unknowingly binding herself more tightly to him with every shared smile. The enchanted medallion blocked her recognition of what they were to each other. She felt the attraction. He could see it in the way her breathing changed when he stood close, the way her pupils dilated when their hands accidentally touched, but she couldn't feel the mate bond pulling her toward him with the same devastating certainty he felt every moment. It was torture. Beautiful, necessary torture. After he'd finished repairing her workshop's sagging roof, the structure had been on the verge of collapse. He found other work around Thorn Ridge. He helped the blacksmith, mended fences for elderly wolves who couldn't manage heavy labor anymore, chopped firewood for widows struggling through summer to prepare for winter. The village began to accept his presence. He was harmless, they decided. A wandering craftsman with good hands and no ambition. Someone who worked for food and shelter and asked for nothing more. Every evening, he found an excuse to walk past Sera's workshop. Sometimes she'd be outside, tending the small garden patch where she grew herbs. They'd talk for a few minutes, conversations growing gradually longer, her wariness slowly transforming into something that looked almost like trust. It was during one of those twilight conversations, 7 weeks after his arrival, that Theron made his mistake. Or perhaps it wasn't a mistake at all. Perhaps it was simply inevitability catching up with him. They were sitting on her workshop steps, watching the sun set over the eastern hills. Sera had just told him about a chair commission she'd completed years ago, an intricate piece with carved wolves running through forest scenes, and how the customer had refused to pay full price because it looked too expensive for what it was. There was wistfulness in her voice that made his chest ache. "Do you believe people can change?" she asked suddenly. "Can someone who's always been seen as one thing become something different?" Theron turned to look at her. The fading sunlight caught amber in her eyes, turned her auburn hair copper. "I think people contain multitudes," he said carefully. "The question isn't whether they can change. It's whether anyone will see them clearly enough to notice they were always more than the labels stuck to them." She was quiet for a long moment. What if someone's been told their entire life that they are worthless? That they'll never be enough? Then those people were blind. The words came out more intense than he'd intended. And cruel. And wrong. Sera's breath caught. Kieran. I know I'm nobody, he interrupted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. I know I have nothing to offer except work and whatever protection a wanderer can provide. But I see you, Sera. I see someone who creates beauty with her hands, who survived cruelty without becoming cruel herself, who deserves so much more than being told she's lacking. The air between them felt charged, dangerous. Sera stared at him with wide eyes, her hands trembling slightly where they rested on her knees. Why? She whispered. Why would you care about someone like me? Because you're my mate. Because my wolf recognized you the moment I saw you. Because every instinct I possess is screaming that you're meant to be mine. But Theron couldn't say any of that. So instead, he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and covered her hand with his. Because caring about you is the easiest thing I've done in years. They sat like that as darkness fell around them, hands touching, something profound and terrifying building between them. And when Sera finally stood to go inside, she looked back at him with an expression that held equal parts hope and fear. Good night, Kieran. Good night, Sera. But they both knew something had shifted. Something irrevocable had been set in motion, and there was no going back now. The rumors started 3 days later. Sera heard them first at the market, where 2 women fell conspicuously silent when she approached. Then at the well, where conversations stopped abruptly when she drew near. By evening, her cousin Vivian appeared at the workshop, her expression a mixture of false concern and barely concealed satisfaction. People are talking, Vivian said without preamble, examining her manicured nails. About you and the drifter. Sera's hands stilled over the wood she'd been sanding. There's nothing to talk about. That's not what everyone's saying. Vivian's voice carried practiced sympathy. They're saying you're spending inappropriate amounts of time with a man who has no family, no property, no prospects. It looks desperate, Sera. The word hit exactly as intended. Desperate. As if her loneliness was so pathetic that even accepting friendship was cause for shame. He's been helping with workshop repairs, Sera said quietly. That's all. Help. Vivian laughed, sharp and cutting. Men don't help without expecting something in return. And when you're 26 and unmarried, people assume they know what that something is. After Vivian left, Sera stood alone in her workshop and felt the familiar weight of judgment settling over her shoulders. But beneath it, something new stirred. A quiet defiance. For the first time in her life, someone saw value in her. And she refused to let the village's poisonous gossip destroy that. Theron heard about Aunt Margot's reaction from the butcher, whose wife was friends with one of the Ashwood family's neighbors. Apparently, Sera's aunt was furious, calling it a disgrace and demanding Sera end whatever inappropriate association existed between them. He found Sera that evening in the small clearing behind her workshop, pulling weeds from her herb garden with more force than necessary. She didn't look up when he approached, but he saw the tension in her shoulders, the redness around her eyes that suggested recent tears. Your aunt spoke to you, he said quietly. My aunt has many opinions about my life. Sera yanked out another weed. Most of them unfavorable. Theron crouched beside her, close enough to speak without being overheard if anyone was watching from the buildings. I can stay away if that would make things easier for you. I don't want to cause you more pain. Sera's hands finally stilled. She looked at him, and there was something fierce in her amber eyes that he hadn't seen before. Do you want to stay away? No, he admitted. But what I want isn't what matters here. Why doesn't it matter? Her voice rose slightly. Why is everyone else's opinion more important than what either of us actually feels? The question hung between them, loaded with everything they hadn't said. Theron could feel his wolf straining against the medallion's suppression, demanding he claim her, mark her, make the bond visible to everyone watching. But he held back, because rushing this would solve nothing. Instead, he reached out and covered her dirt-stained hand with his. It doesn't matter, he said firmly. Not to me. But I need you to understand what you're choosing. If I stay, if we continue spending time together, the gossip will get worse. Your family will push harder. The village will judge you more harshly. I can handle their opinions, but you shouldn't have to suffer for my presence. Sera looked down at their joined hands. What if I told you their judgment is nothing compared to the loneliness I felt before you arrived? What if I said I'd rather face their cruelty with you beside me than face their pity alone? Theron's chest tightened. Then I'd say you're braver than anyone in this village deserves. She smiled, small and fragile but genuine. I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being afraid. They stayed like that as twilight deepened around them, two people choosing each other despite the world's determination to keep them apart. And Theron knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened with his mission, whatever consequences came from revealing the truth, he would never regret this moment. The investigation was reaching critical mass. Theron had spent the last 2 months carefully documenting everything. Meeting sites where rogues gathered. Trade routes where human mercenaries moved with suspicious freedom. Financial records he'd glimpsed through creative observation, showing payments flowing from Alpha Donovan's territory to known rogue leaders. The conspiracy was real and dangerous. Donovan was facilitating an alliance between discontented rogues and human hunters, planning something large-scale that would destabilize the entire Eastern Territories. Theron had sent coded messages through traveling merchants, reports that made their way to safe houses and eventually to Marcus at Silverpeak. His beaters' responses confirmed what Theron suspected. This required immediate intervention. But intervention meant revealing himself. Meant returning to the capital. Meant ending the life he'd built with Sera over the past 2 months. He stood in his rented room above the village tavern, holding the latest message from Marcus, and felt torn in 2 directions. Duty demanded he return. His wolf demanded he stay. The decision was made for him when another message arrived 3 days later, this one urgent. Alpha Donovan was dying, had requested to speak with Theron specifically, and wanted to confess before death claimed him. Theron had no choice but to go. "I'll be back in 4 days, he promised Sera, hating the lie even as he spoke it. "I have to travel north for work. But I promise I'll return." She looked at him with those amber eyes, trusting despite every reason not to. "Be safe. Always." He wanted to kiss her, wanted to tell her everything, wanted to make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Instead, he simply held her hand for a moment longer than necessary. "I'll be back." But when he returned from Donovan's deathbed confession, returned with confirmation that the conspiracy was real, that he'd completed his mission and now had to return to Silverpeak, he found Aunt Margot waiting at his rented room with poison dripping from every word. "I know what you are," Margot said, her eyes sharp with malicious triumph. "I sent inquiries north. No one's heard of a craftsman named Kieran. No one knows where you came from. You're lying about everything, aren't you?" Theron's blood ran cold. "I'm a private person. That doesn't make me a liar." "Then prove it. Come to the Commons tomorrow at noon. Let everyone see you're legitimate. Or are you planning to disappear before the girl realizes she's been fooled?" The next day, Aunt Margot orchestrated the public humiliation with theatrical precision. She'd gathered the entire village, positioned Sera in the center like a spectacle, and built her entire performance around the assumption that Kieran would flee rather than face scrutiny. She'd miscalculated badly. Theron walked through that hostile crowd because his mate needed him, because he'd promised to stand beside her, because every instinct he possessed demanded he protect what was his. When he offered marriage, when he spoke those words about seeing her value, he meant every syllable. The deception about his identity didn't change the truth of his feelings. And when Sera whispered yes, when she chose him despite everything, Theron felt something fundamental lock into place. The next evening, under the full moon with ancient words spoken and hands bound with ceremonial cord, they were handfasts. It was legal, binding, and undeniable. When Theron kissed his new wife under moonlight, when he felt her melt into him despite not being able to sense the mate bond the medallion blocked from her awareness, he understood that he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. He'd married his mate while lying about everything he was. The weeks that followed were simultaneously the happiest and most guilt-ridden of his life. During the day, he continued his investigation. He finally confirmed that Alpha Donovan was actively coordinating meetings between hunters and rogue wolves, planning something large-scale that would destabilize the Eastern Territories and potentially spark conflict with human settlements. At night, he returned to the small cottage they'd rented together, Sera having finally escaped her aunt's household, to a marriage that felt more real than anything he'd experienced in his 39 years. She taught him things about himself he'd never known. That he could be gentle. That he could listen before commanding. That ruling through compassion might actually be more effective than ruling through fear. She made him want to be better, not as a king, but as a man. And with every passing day, the deception grew heavier. 10 weeks into their marriage, everything came to a head. Theron received an urgent message through the coded channels. Alpha Donovan was dead, had confessed to everything before dying, and had specifically named Theron as the one who'd uncovered the conspiracy. The dying Alpha's confession meant Theron's mission was complete. He had the evidence he needed. But it also meant people were looking for the king in hiding, connecting dots, asking questions. He had to reveal himself. Had to return to Silverpeak. Had to face the consequences of his deception. But first, he had to tell Sera the truth. He found Aunt Margot had beaten him to it. When he arrived at their cottage that evening, he found Sera standing in the center of the small room, her face pale, her hands shaking, and Margot standing beside her with triumphant cruelty written across every feature. "Is it true?" Sera asked, her voice breaking. "Has everything been a lie?" Theron's chest felt like it was caving in. "Sera, tell me," she shouted, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Were you lying to me?" And Theron, who'd built an entire life on careful strategy and calculated deception, chose truth. "Yes," he said. "I've been lying." He watched her face crumble, watched the fragile trust she'd built shatter like glass. And before he could lose his nerve, before he could convince himself that maintaining the lie was somehow kinder, Theron reached up and removed the enchanted medallion. The transformation was instantaneous. His alpha aura exploded outward like a shockwave, flooding the cottage with power that made every wolf present drop to their knees. The dominance wasn't just strong, it was absolute, undeniable, the kind of presence that could only come from someone who ruled kingdoms. Margot fell backward, her face draining of color. Vivian, who'd come to watch the confrontation, gasped and prostrated herself without conscious thought. The neighbors who'd gathered to witness Sera's humiliation collapsed under the weight of royal authority. And Sera's eyes went wide as his true scent finally hit her. Pine and mountain snow and ancient power. The scent that had been hidden from her for 3 months by magic and lies. The mate bond snapped into place with devastating force. No longer blocked by the medallion's enchantment, it roared through her with recognition so strong she staggered. Her wolf surged forward, finally understanding what had been kept from her, finally feeling the pull that had been there all along but muted into something she couldn't quite name. This wasn't just attraction or even love. This was destiny, claiming her so completely she couldn't breathe through the intensity of it. "My name is Theron Blackmoor," he said into the shocked silence. "I'm the Alpha King of Silverpeak. I came here 3 months ago in disguise to investigate reports of rogues and hunters conspiring against the Eastern Territories." He looked directly at Sera, whose hand had come up to her chest as if she could physically feel the bond settling into every cell of her body. "I found evidence of that conspiracy, but I also found something I'd stopped believing existed." His voice softened. "I found my true mate, my destined Lunar Queen. And I married her before revealing the truth because I wanted her to choose me as a man, not as a king." The silence was absolute. Then Margot found her voice, strangled and disbelieving. You're the king." "Yes." Theron's eyes never left Sera's face. "And your niece, the one you called worthless, the one you treated as a burden, is the Lunar Queen of Silverpeak. She always was. You were just too blind to see it." Tears spilled down Sera's cheeks, but she couldn't tell if they were from shock, betrayal, or the overwhelming surge of recognition flooding through her system. "I can feel it now," she whispered, her voice raw. "The bond. It's like I've been reaching for you my whole life without understanding why." "The medallion blocked it," Theron explained gently, taking a careful step toward her. "Kept you from recognizing what I felt from the first moment I saw you. I'm sorry I hid it. I'm sorry I lied. But I'm not sorry I married you before revealing the truth, because I needed you to know, my feelings have nothing to do with duty or politics. I chose you because you're mine and I'm yours, and that was always going to be true regardless of crowns or kingdoms." Sera let out a shaky breath, her hands fisting in her worn dress as if anchoring herself against the overwhelming surge of recognition, desire, and belonging flooding through her. Around them, the cottage remained frozen. Margot pale and speechless, Vivian stunned into silence, the gathered neighbors still on their knees under the weight of royal dominance they'd never felt before. The entire world had turned upside down in the span of seconds. And then, cutting through the charged silence, a sound split the air, a howl from the northern boundary. Then another. And another. Theron's head snapped up, his alpha instincts recognizing the pattern immediately. That wasn't a territorial dispute. That wasn't a hunt gone wrong. That was a warning call. An attack! The rogues he'd been tracking, the conspiracy he'd uncovered, it was happening now. "Everyone get inside," Theron commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a king. "Bar your doors. Don't come out until I give the all clear." He turned to Sera, cupping her face in his hands. "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" She was still reeling from the revelations, from the mate bond overwhelming her senses, from discovering her vagrant husband was actually a king. But she looked into his storm-grey eyes and saw the same man who'd carried timber for her, who'd fixed her roof, who'd chosen her when everyone else dismissed her. "Yes," she whispered. "Good." He pressed a hard, quick kiss to her forehead. "Stay inside. No matter what you hear. I'll come back for you." Then he was moving, striding out of the cottage with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent decades leading warriors into battle. And as Sera watched him go, watched her husband transform from the gentle craftsman she'd married into the powerful king he'd always been, she realized something profound. She'd chosen him. And now he was about to show the entire world exactly what that choice meant. The night air hit Theron like a physical force as he strode out of the cottage, his true alpha power no longer contained by the medallion's magic. Every wolf within a mile radius could feel it now, the overwhelming pressure of dominance that marked him as something far beyond a simple alpha. He was royalty. Ancient bloodline. The kind of power that bent the world around it. The howls were closer now, coming from multiple directions. A coordinated attack, just as he'd feared. The rogues and their hunter allies had chosen tonight, perhaps sensing weakness in a small village with no strong alpha to defend it. They'd made a fatal miscalculation. Thornridge had a king. Theron's wolf surged forward as he shifted mid-stride, bones restructuring with practiced ease, dark hair transforming into midnight black fur that seemed to absorb moonlight rather than reflect it. His shifted form was massive, easily twice the size of a normal wolf, with storm-grey eyes that glowed with predatory intelligence. This was the form that had led armies, that had defended Silverpeak's borders for 15 years, that had never lost a battle. The first rogue broke through the tree line at the village's northern edge. A massive male with scarred flanks and wild eyes, the scent of blood already on his fur. Behind him came 4 more, then 7, then a dozen. Too many for coincidence. Too organized for random violence. This was the attack Donovan had warned about before dying. The conspiracy finally showing its teeth. But they froze when they saw Theron. Every predator instinct they possessed screamed at them to submit or flee. The alpha standing between them and their targets wasn't just stronger, he was apex, the kind of power that rewrote the hierarchy through sheer presence. One of the rogues whimpered and immediately dropped into a submissive crouch. Theron didn't give them the chance to retreat. These wolves had come to slaughter innocents, to kill families in their homes, to prove that the old pack structures could be broken through fear and violence. They'd chosen this path. Now they'd face the consequences. He moved like shadow-given form, covering the distance between them in heartbeats. His jaws closed around the throat of the lead rogue before the wolf could even think to dodge, and the crack of vertebrae echoed across the village commons. The others scattered, but Theron was already moving, herding them away from the cottages, away from the innocents cowering inside. 3 more rogues fell in quick succession, their arrogance no match for centuries of battle experience and raw power. The remaining wolves finally understood what they'd stumbled into and began to retreat in earnest. But from the eastern edge of the village came new sounds. Human shouts. The metallic ring of weapons being drawn. The distinctive scent of silver and blessed iron. The hunters. Theron shifted back to human form in the space between one breath and the next, standing naked in the moonlight with blood on his hands and absolute fury in his eyes. A dozen men emerged from the forest, carrying crossbows loaded with silver-tipped bolts and blades that gleamed with the telltale sheen of blessed metal designed specifically to kill wolves. "Well," their leader said, a grizzled man with calculating eyes and multiple scars. Donovan said there might be complications. Didn't mention the complications would include royalty. "Alpha Donovan is dead," Theron said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the distance. And his confession before dying implicated every single person involved in this conspiracy. Including you, Garrett Stone, former captain of the Eastern Border Guard, dishonorably discharged for arms trafficking. Stone's expression flickered, surprise, then grudging respect. "You're better informed than expected. But you also alone, outnumbered, and standing between us and a village full of wolves who won't know what killed them until it's too late." He raised his crossbow. "So here's my offer, walk away. You've got your mate secured. You've completed whatever investigation brought you here. Leave, and we'll forget this happened." "Counter-proposal," Theron said calmly. "You surrender now, and I'll ensure your deaths are quick rather than letting the families of everyone you've killed decide your fates." Stone laughed and aimed. "I was hoping you'd be difficult." The bolt flew true, aimed directly at Theron's heart. But he was already moving, faster than human reflexes should allow, the bolt passing through empty air where he'd been standing a fraction of a second before. His hand closed around a fallen branch, and when his alpha power poured into it, the wood hardened into something closer to steel. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration. Theron moved through the hunters like a force of nature, disarming them with brutal efficiency, breaking bones with calculated precision. These were trained fighters, men who'd killed wolves before and expected to kill more tonight. But they'd never faced someone who'd spent 39 years learning every way a fight could unfold, who could read body language like written text, who moved with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted the outcome. Within minutes, half the hunters were on the ground groaning, their weapons scattered. The other half had the sense to drop their weapons and raise their hands in surrender. Stone himself was on his knees with Theron's makeshift weapon pressed against his throat. "The conspiracy ends tonight," Theron said quietly. "Every name, every contact, every pack member who was involved. You're going to tell me everything." "And if I don't?" Stone gasped. "Then I'll let the village decide what to do with the man who came to murder their children." Theron increased the pressure slightly. "Your choice." Stone's resistance crumbled. He talked. Dawn was breaking over Thorn Ridge when Marcus arrived with 50 royal guards, their armor bearing the Silver Mountain crest of Silverpeak. They'd ridden through the night, summoned by the emergency signal Theron had sent when Donovan first confessed. The sight of the Beta Commander and the Royal Guard riding into the village commons made the entire population emerge from their homes despite the danger having passed. Marcus took in the scene with practiced efficiency, the dead rogues, the captured hunters bound and guarded by village volunteers, and his king standing in the center of it all, wearing borrowed clothes and looking every inch the warrior he'd always been. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, dismounting and dropping to one knee. Behind him, 50 guards followed suit, the synchronized movement so perfectly executed it looked like choreographed dance. The village went silent. If there had been any doubt about Kieran's identity, any whisper that perhaps the vagrant had been lying about being king, it died in that moment. The royal guard didn't kneel for anyone except their sovereign. Theron clasped Marcus's shoulder, pulling him to his feet. "You made good time. We rode hard once we received your signal." Marcus's eyes scanned his king, checking for injuries, then swept across the village. The situation: contained. 14 rogues dead, 4 captured. 18 hunters captured, including their leader, Garrett Stone. His been cooperative. Theron's tone made it clear that cooperation had required persuasion. "I have names, locations, and enough evidence to dismantle what remains of the conspiracy. Alpha Donovan is dead, but he confessed before the end. He'd been facilitating the alliance, providing safe passage through his territory. When I exposed him, the hunters came here instead, thinking Thorn Ridge would be easy prey." Theron's jaw tightened. "They were wrong." Marcus nodded, then his attention shifted to the cottage where Sera stood in the doorway, watching with wide eyes. Even from a distance, even without being able to sense the mate bond himself, Marcus could see the way his king's entire posture changed when he looked at her. The tension eased. The cold calculation warmed into something almost gentle. "So it's true," Marcus said quietly. "You found her." "I found her." Theron's voice held something Marcus had never heard before: vulnerability, wonder, and underneath it all, absolute certainty. "Marcus, meet Sera Blackmoor. My wife, my mate, your Lunar Queen." The title hung in the air, and Marcus saw the moment it truly registered for the watching villagers. Not just the king's wife, the Lunar Queen, the highest-ranking female wolf in all of Silverpeak, chosen by destiny itself, bound to the king by magic and fate. The same woman they'd called worthless 3 months ago. Marcus approached Sera and dropped to one knee, his fist over his heart in the traditional gesture of fealty. "Your Majesty, I am Marcus Thorn, Beta Commander of Silverpeak and your humble servant. The kingdom has waited a long time for your arrival." Sera looked overwhelmed, her hands clutching the door frame as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. But she found her voice, and when she spoke, it was steady despite her obvious shock. "Please stand, Beta Commander. I'm still learning what all of this means." "You'll have time," Marcus assured her, rising gracefully. "And assistance. The entire kingdom will support you." Movement behind Sera caught Theron's attention. Aunt Margot had emerged from wherever she'd been hiding during the attack, her face ashen, her earlier theatrical outrage replaced by something that looked almost like terror. Behind her came the rest of the Ashwood family, Vivian looking 10 years older than she had the day before, and several other relatives Theron recognized from his weeks observing the village dynamics. They'd witnessed everything: the battle, the royal guard, their niece being addressed as royalty by warriors who would die on her command. The karma Theron had promised was beginning. The next hours passed in organized chaos. Marcus's guards secured the prisoners, documented evidence, and began the process of transporting everything back to Silverpeak for formal trials. Theron gave orders with the natural authority of someone who'd ruled for decades, and the village watched in stunned silence as the man they'd thought was a vagrant coordinated military operations with precision that spoke to years of command experience. But eventually, the immediate crisis was handled, and Theron found himself standing in the cottage he'd shared with Sera for 2 months, looking at the simple life they'd built together and knowing it was over. "We'll leave at midday," he told her gently. "That gives you time to gather anything you want to bring, to say goodbye to anyone who matters." Sera looked around the small cottage, at the table where they'd shared meals, at the fireplace where they'd talked through long evenings, at the bed where they'd held each other and pretended the outside world didn't exist. "This was real, wasn't it?" she asked, her voice small. "These 3 months. They were real." "The realest thing in my life," Theron said, crossing to her and taking her hands. "Everything else was deception. But what we built here, what we feel, that was never a lie." She nodded, tears gathering in her amber eyes. "I don't know how to be a queen. You already know how to be brave, how to be kind, how to see value in people others dismiss. That's what matters most." He brushed away a tear with his thumb. "The rest we'll figure out together." A knock at the door interrupted them. Theron opened it to find one of Sera's uncles standing there, hat in his hands, looking smaller than Theron had ever seen him. "Your Majesty," the man said, the title awkward in his mouth. Could I speak with my niece before you go?" Theron looked at Sera, letting her decide. She hesitated, then nodded. He stepped outside, giving them privacy, and found Marcus waiting with an expression that suggested he had news. "The village elders want to offer formal apology," Marcus said quietly, "for the treatment of the Lunar Queen. They are terrified you'll take offense and withdraw protection from Thorn Ridge." "Let them be terrified for a while," Theron said without sympathy. "They earned it. But Thorn Ridge will remain under royal protection, for Sera's sake, not theirs." Inside the cottage, Sera faced her uncle for the first time since learning the truth. Uncle Raymond looked at her, and she saw something she'd never seen before in his eyes, genuine regret. "I failed you," he said simply. "Your aunt, she's always been the stronger personality, and I let her control too much. I told myself it was easier to keep the peace. But the truth is, I was a coward." He pulled a small wooden box from his pocket. "This was your mother's. She left it to you when she died, but Margot hid it away. It's not much, some coins, a few pieces of jewelry, letters she wrote to you before she passed. But it's yours. I should have given it to you years ago." Sera took the box with trembling hands. "What about Aunt Margot? Vivian? Do they feel this regret too?" Raymond's silence was answer enough. "Some people learned from their mistakes. Others simply learned to fear the consequences. I don't expect forgiveness," Raymond said quietly. "I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know, I'm proud of you. For having the courage to choose happiness despite us. For being strong enough to leave when we gave you every reason to stay small. You're going to be an extraordinary queen." He left before she could respond, and Sera stood alone in the cottage holding her mother's legacy, crying for the family she'd never had and the uncle who'd finally found his voice too late to matter. By midday, the entire village had gathered to watch the Lunar Queen's departure. 8 royal carriages had arrived, along with another contingent of guards and several ladies-in-waiting sent by Marcus to attend to Sera's needs. The contrast between the shabby village and the obvious wealth of the royal procession couldn't have been starker. Aunt Margot stood at the edge of the crowd, her face a mask of complicated emotions. She'd lost the power to hurt Sera, lost the ability to define her niece's worth, lost everything that had made her feel superior. And she'd lost it all not through revenge or punishment, but through the simple fact that Sera had found someone who saw her true value. Vivian stood with her husband, both of them pale and quiet. She'd spent years mocking her elder cousin, had laughed at her desperation, had celebrated her own comfortable marriage as proof of superiority. Now she watched that same cousin being addressed as Your Majesty by warriors and nobles, watched her about to enter a life of wealth and power Vivian couldn't even imagine. The karma was silent but devastating. No one punished them. No one even acknowledged them. They simply had to stand there and watch the woman they'd treated as worthless become something they never could be. Sera emerged from the cottage wearing a traveling dress provided by the royal household, simple but well-made, the kind of quality she'd never worn in her life. Her auburn hair was braided in a style befitting nobility, and a small circlet of silver rested on her head, marking her status as Lunar Queen even before the formal coronation. She looked terrified and brave and beautiful. Theron waited beside the lead carriage, having changed into proper clothing, dark leather and fine wool, the silver mountain crest of Silverpeak embroidered over his heart. He looked every inch the king now, all traces of the wandering craftsman carefully erased. But when Sera approached, his expression softened into something private and tender. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She glanced back at Thornridge, at the workshop that had been both prison and sanctuary, at the family that had never valued her, at the village that had never seen her. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." Theron helped her into the carriage, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. Then he mounted his horse, a magnificent grey stallion that had been brought from Silverpeak, and gave the signal to depart. As the procession began to move, Sera looked out the carriage window one last time. She saw Uncle Raymond standing apart from the others, his hat in his hands, regret written in every line of his weathered face. She saw Aunt Margot, stiff and pale, unable to meet her eyes. She saw Vivian whispering to her husband, their earlier smugness replaced by something that looked almost like envy. And she saw the village elders, all of them bowing deeply as the carriage passed, showing the respect they'd never shown when she was simply Sera Ashwood, the niece no one wanted. The karma was complete. They hadn't been punished. They hadn't been destroyed. They simply had to live with the weight of knowing they'd thrown away something precious, and by the time they realized its value, it was already gone. As Thornridge disappeared behind the trees, Sera felt something shift inside her. The old Sera, the one who'd believed she was worthless, who'd accepted cruelty as her due, who'd never dared to hope for more, was being left behind with the village. What moved forward was someone new. Someone who'd been chosen by destiny, claimed by a king, and revealed to have worth she'd never been allowed to see. She was Sera Blackmoor now, Lunar Queen of Silverpeak. And her real story was only just beginning. The journey to Silverpeak took 4 days, and with each mile they traveled, the landscape transformed. The struggling, contested territories of the borderlands gave way to prosperous farmlands where crops grew thick and healthy. Then came rolling hills dotted with thriving villages, their cottages well maintained, their people clearly comfortable rather than merely surviving. And finally, the mountains themselves rose ahead, ancient, imposing, beautiful in their stark grandeur. Sera spent most of the journey in the carriage, watching the world change outside her window while trying to process everything that had happened. The revelations still felt surreal. Her vagrant husband was a king. The mate bond she'd never felt suddenly roared through her with devastating clarity. The life she'd known was gone, replaced by something she couldn't yet comprehend. Theron rode alongside her carriage during the day, occasionally stopping to check on her, to answer questions, to simply be present. At night, they stayed in royal waypoints, small but well-appointed buildings maintained specifically for the king's travels, and he would hold her while she trembled with anxiety about the future rushing toward them. "What if they don't accept me?" she asked on the second night, curled against his chest in the darkness. "What if the council sees me as everyone in Thornridge did, a poor village woman with nothing to offer?" "Then they'll learn the same lesson Thornridge learned," Theron said firmly. "That judging someone by their circumstances rather than their character is the fastest way to reveal your own limitations." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Besides, you're not just anyone. You're my mate. Destiny chose you, not politics or strategy or careful negotiation. The council will have to accept that. But what if I fail?" The fear in her voice was raw, honest. "What if I don't know how to be what they need?" "Then you'll learn, the same way you learned to survive your family, to find strength when everyone told you were weak, to choose happiness despite every obstacle." He tilted her face up to look at him. "You're already stronger than most wolves I've known. You just haven't had anyone tell you that before." She kissed him then, pouring all her fear and hope and desperate love into the connection between them. And Theron held her like she was the most precious thing in his kingdom, because she was. The palace of Silverpeak came into view on the afternoon of the 4th day, and Sera's breath caught. It wasn't a single building but rather a sprawling complex built into the mountainside itself, with towers reaching toward the sky and walls that looked like they'd stood since the beginning of time. Waterfalls cascaded down the cliffs on either side, their mist creating rainbows in the afternoon sun, and the whole structure seemed to pulse with power that was both beautiful and intimidating. "This is home," Theron said, riding close to her carriage window. "You're home now." Home. The word felt foreign, impossible. How could a place this grand, this ancient, Ever feel like home to someone who'd grown up in a workshop with a leaking roof? But as they passed through the massive gates, guards saluting with fists over hearts, their faces showing genuine joy at their king's return, Sera saw something that eased her anxiety slightly. The palace wasn't just a monument to power. It was alive, functional, filled with people going about their daily work. Servants hurried across courtyards, guards trained in practice yards, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear children laughing. It was a home, just on a scale she'd never imagined. The carriage stopped in the main courtyard, where what appeared to be the entire palace staff had gathered. Hundreds of wolves stood in organized rows, all dressed in formal livery, all waiting to meet their new lunar queen. Theron dismounted and opened the carriage door himself, extending his hand to help Sera down. She took it, grateful for his steady presence, and stepped out into the weight of hundreds of watching eyes. People of Silverpeak, Theron's voice carried across the courtyard with natural authority. I present to you Sera Blackmoor, my true mate and your lunar queen. She comes from humble beginnings, which makes her uniquely suited to understand the struggles of all our people, not just the privileged few. I expect you to serve her as you serve me, with loyalty, respect, and unwavering dedication. The response was immediate. As one, the assembled crowd dropped to one knee, heads bowed in a gesture of absolute fealty. The synchronized movement was so perfectly executed it looked like a wave flowing across the courtyard. Your Majesty, they said in unison. Welcome home. Sera felt tears prick her eyes. Welcome home. Words she'd never heard from her own family, now offered by hundreds of strangers who owed her nothing but duty. The first council meeting happened that evening, before she even had time to properly settle into her new chambers. Theron had apologized for the timing but explained that the conspiracy they'd uncovered required immediate attention, and the council needed to understand everything that had happened, including how he'd found his mate. Sera sat beside him at the head of a long granite table, wearing a gown that had been hastily altered to fit her, deep emerald silk embroidered with silver wolves, far finer than anything she'd ever touched before. Around the table sat 12 council members, their faces showing varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and barely concealed shock. Lord Cassian, the elderly councillor who'd been pushing for Theron to marry, looked like he'd bitten into something sour. Your Majesty, Cassian began carefully, while we're grateful you've finally taken a mate, we must express concern about the circumstances. A village woman with no noble blood, no political connections, no training in governance, is exactly what this kingdom needs, Theron interrupted, his voice carrying an edge that made Cassian fall silent. I spent 3 months living among common wolves, seeing firsthand how our policies affect those without power or privilege. Sera knows those struggles intimately. She understands what it means to be overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. That perspective is invaluable. But Your Majesty, Lady Isadora spoke carefully, understanding hardship and governing a kingdom are vastly different skills. Perhaps the Lunar Queen could benefit from extensive training before taking an active role in. I don't need her to benefit from anything except your respect and support. Theron's tone went cold. She's my mate, chosen by destiny itself. That makes her Lunar Queen with all the authority and responsibility that entails. If any of you have a problem with that, you're welcome to resign from this council. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Sera sat perfectly still, feeling every eye on her, feeling the weight of their doubt and judgment. It was Thornridge all over again, being told she wasn't enough, would never be enough, needed to be fixed or hidden or changed. But then she thought about Theron's hand pulling her up in the village commons, about his voice telling her she didn't kneel for anyone, about 3 months of being valued, respected, seen. And she found her voice. You're right to be concerned, Sera said quietly but clearly enough that everyone heard. I don't have noble blood. I don't have political connections. I wasn't raised to govern. She met each council member's eyes in turn. But I was raised to survive cruelty, to find kindness in harsh places, to see the worth in people others dismissed. And I learned that power without compassion is just tyranny wearing a crown. She took a breath, feeling Theron's hand close over hers under the table in silent support. I'm not here to replace what you do or claim I know better. I'm here to learn, to serve, and to make sure this kingdom's strength includes taking care of those who can't take care of themselves. If that's not something you can accept, then perhaps His Majesty is right. Perhaps you should consider whether you're still suited for this council. The silence that followed was different. Surprised. Thoughtful. Lord Cassian's expression shifted from contempt to something that might have been grudging respect. Lady Isadora actually smiled slightly. Marcus, sitting at the far end of the table, caught Theron's eye and nodded once, a clear sign of approval. "Well," Lord Cassian said finally, "perhaps there's more to your majesty than first appears. Time will tell." "Yes," Sera agreed. "It will." The weeks that followed were the hardest of Sera's life. Harder than living under Aunt Margot's cruelty. Harder than facing public humiliation. Harder than anything she'd experienced before, because for the first time, she actually had something to lose. The palace was a maze of protocol she didn't understand, of social hierarchies she'd never learned, of expectations she couldn't meet. There were formal dinners where she used the wrong utensil and felt the noble's eyes tracking her mistake. There were audiences with visiting alphas who barely concealed their disdain for a lunar queen without proper bloodline. There were council meetings where she understood only half the political maneuvering happening around her. And there were whispers. Always whispers. The king's little craftswoman. Chosen by accident, not design. She'll embarrass the kingdom sooner or later. Sera heard them all, felt them chip away at her confidence, and fought not to believe them. But doubt was an old companion, and it knew exactly how to find the cracks in her armor. 3 weeks into her new life, she broke down. She was in their private chambers, had been attempting to memorize the names and histories of 17 different noble families for an upcoming reception, and suddenly the weight of it all crushed down on her like an avalanche. Theron found her sobbing on the floor, surrounded by scattered papers, her hands shaking uncontrollably. He gathered her into his arms without a word, let her cry against his chest until she had no tears left. "I'm failing," she whispered finally, her voice raw. "I can feel them judging me, waiting for me to prove I don't belong here. And maybe they are right. Maybe I'm not strong enough for this." "You're wrong," Theron said firmly. "You're not failing. You're learning. There's a difference." "How can you be sure?" "Because I watch you every day," he said, tilting her face up to look at him. "I watch you treat servants with the same respect you give council members. I watch you listen to petitions from common wolves and actually hear what they are saying, not just what you want to hear. I watch you find solutions others miss because you understand what it means to have nothing and need everything." He brushed away her tears with gentle thumbs. "The council wanted me to marry someone who knew how to play political games, someone who could navigate high society without making waves. But I didn't need another politician. I needed someone with a moral compass that pointed true north regardless of who was watching. I needed you." "But I don't know how to be a queen," she said helplessly. "Then let me tell you a secret." Theron smiled slightly. "Neither did I when I first took the throne. I was 24, barely more than a boy, and suddenly I was responsible for millions of lives. I made mistakes. I failed. I learned. And eventually, I became the king Silverpeak needed, not because I was perfect, but because I refused to stop trying." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Give yourself the same grace you'd give anyone else. Learn, grow, and trust that the reason destiny chose you isn't because you were already perfect, but because you have the capacity to become everything this kingdom needs." The turning point came 5 weeks after Sera's arrival, during a formal audience with representatives from the smaller eastern packs. One of them, an older female named Helena from a pack that had been devastated by the rogue attacks, was explaining the struggles her people faced when Lord Cassian interrupted with the standard response. Resources would be allocated according to established protocols. Investigations would be conducted. The council would review options. It was diplomatic, proper, and completely inadequate. Sera watched Helena's face fall, watched hope die in the woman's eyes, and felt something snap inside her. She stood, ignoring the startled looks from the council, and walked down from the dais to stand directly in front of Helena. "Tell me what you actually need," Sera said quietly. "Not what sounds good in an official report. What would actually help your people right now?" Helena stared at her, clearly shocked that the Lunar Queen was addressing her directly, speaking to her as an equal rather than a subject. "Your Majesty," Helena's voice caught. "We need healers. We lost ours in the attacks, and we don't have the resources to attract new ones. And we need builders. Our homes were destroyed, and winter is coming. But most of all," she swallowed hard, "we need to know someone remembers we exist. That we matter." Sera turned to look at Lord Cassian. "How long would your established protocols take to deliver help?" 3 to 4 months, Your Majesty," he said stiffly. "We must conduct proper assessments, allocate resources appropriately." "They'll be dead by then," Sera said bluntly. "Or scattered to other territories, their pact dissolved." She looked at Theron. "We have royal healers, don't we?" More than the palace actually needs. We do, Theron confirmed, watching her with something that looked like pride. And we have builders on staff for palace maintenance. Yes. Then we send them today. Sera's voice carried authority she didn't know she possessed. 6 healers, 12 builders, and enough supplies to get them through winter. Not in 3 months. Today. She looked back at Helena. Will that help? Helena's eyes filled with tears. Your Majesty, that would, yes. That would save us. Then it's done. Sera turned to the council, her chin lifted in unconscious challenge. Unless someone objects. No one did. How could they? She'd just solved a problem in 5 minutes that they'd been reviewing for months. More importantly, she'd done it by actually listening to what was needed rather than hiding behind protocol. After the audience ended, Theron pulled her aside, his eyes bright with something fierce and proud. Do you know what you just did? Probably violated a dozen protocols, Sera said nervously. You led, Theron said firmly. You saw a problem, understood it, and implemented a solution. That's what a Lunar Queen does. That's what a leader does. He cupped her face in his hands. The council just watched you embody exactly what I've been trying to teach them for years, that sometimes the most efficient solution is the compassionate one. His smile was radiant. You're not failing, Sera. You're transforming this kingdom one decision at a time. Word of the Lunar Queen's intervention spread quickly through the palace, then through the kingdom. Other petitioners began requesting audiences specifically with her, knowing she would listen with empathy rather than just political calculation. She started implementing small changes, a fund for widowed wolves, educational programs for orphaned pups, support systems for struggling packs. The council stopped questioning her presence and started asking her opinion. The nobles stopped whispering about her common origins and started seeking her favor. And slowly, gradually, the kingdom began to see what Theron had seen from the beginning, that Sera's greatest strength wasn't despite her humble background. It was because of it. 6 weeks after her arrival, Sera was walking through the palace gardens when she encountered a young servant girl crying behind the rose bushes. What's wrong? Sera asked gently, kneeling beside the girl despite her fine dress. The girl looked up, eyes wide with terror at being caught by the Lunar Queen herself. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, I didn't mean to, I just... It's all right, Sera said softly. You're not in trouble. I just want to know if I can help. The story came out in halting fragments. The girl's mother was sick, needed medicine they couldn't afford. The girl was trying to work extra shifts to save money, but it wasn't enough, and she was so tired and scared and... What's your mother's name? Sera asked. Sera Ashwood, Your Majesty. She works in the laundry. Come with me. Sera took the girl directly to the royal physician, explained the situation, and ensured Clara received the best care available. Then she arranged for the family to receive a stipend to cover expenses until Clara recovered. The girl cried and tried to thank her, but Sera just smiled. Take care of your mother. That's thanks enough. That evening, when Theron asked about her day, she mentioned the incident almost as an afterthought. His expression went soft. You do realize what you did, don't you? Helped someone who needed it. You saw a need and filled it without checking protocols, without asking permission, without calculating political advantage. You just helped. Because it was the right thing to do. He pulled her close. That's the kind of Lunar Queen this kingdom has needed for a very long time. The kind I've needed. 3 months after her arrival, the formal coronation ceremony took place in the Great Hall. Sera stood before the assembled kingdom wearing a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to shimmer with captured starlight. Her auburn hair had been arranged in an intricate style with small silver wolves woven throughout, and around her neck hung the Lunar's medallion, an ancient artifact passed down through generations of queens. The hall was packed with nobles, council members, representatives from every pack in the kingdom, and common wolves who'd traveled for days just to witness this moment. Theron placed the crown on her head himself, a delicate circlet of silver and sapphires that seemed to glow with its own light. His voice carried across the hall with absolute authority. I present to you Sera Blackmoor, Lunar Queen of Silverpeak. Chosen by destiny, tested by hardship, and proven through compassion. She will lead beside me, not because tradition demands it, but because this kingdom deserves a Lunar who understands what it means to suffer, to endure, and to rise. The applause was thunderous. And in the front rows, Sera saw faces that made her chest tight with emotion. Helena from the Eastern Pack, now healthy and smiling. The The widow whose children she'd enrolled in educational programs. The elderly wolves whose medical care she'd personally ensured. Clara Ashworth and her daughter, both healthy now, both beaming with pride. They weren't clapping out of duty. They were clapping because she'd earned their respect. That evening, alone in their chambers with the crown set aside and the formal gown replaced by comfortable silk, Theron pulled her close and pressed his forehead against hers. "How does it feel?" "Like I'm finally home," Sera whispered. "Really home. Not because of the crown or the title, but because I finally found a place where I belong." "You've always belonged," Theron said softly. "The world just needed time to catch up to what I saw from the beginning." He kissed her gently, reverently. "My Luna. My mate. My queen." And Sera, who had spent 26 years believing she was worthless, who had been humiliated and dismissed and told she would never be enough, finally understood the truth. She had always been enough. The problem had never been her lack of worth. It had been everyone else's inability to see it. But destiny had seen. Theron had seen. And now an entire kingdom saw what had been there all along, a woman with the strength to endure, the wisdom to learn, and the compassion to lead. The wolf they'd called worthless had become the queen they needed. And in the end, that was the greatest justice of all.